Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my personal journey of how I landed a UX job without going through a boot camp or spending a lot of money on, like a degree or certificate and without quitting my full-time job. So my name is Cici, and when I am not up to my eyeballs in Figma files, you can catch me doing aerial silks, taking photos during golden hour, or trying to perfect a swing out. So today I'm going to be sharing my personal journey of how I landed this full-time job in UX without quitting my non-UX full-time job and not spending all that money on, expensive resources. So I know most of you guys are still in university, so not everything is necessarily going to be fully applicable, but I will be trying to share a lot of different resources and tips that I wish I knew about getting into the industry that I hope will be helpful to you guys. So I graduated from Duke in 2018 with a major in behavioral economics, which you'll know if you're a Duke student isn't actually a major that is offered. I actually made my own major because I switched around majors so many times and I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. I just knew I really liked exploring the intersection of how humans irrationally interact with known principles of the world. I'd later find out that what I was really interested in was that human-computer interaction piece, which is also not a major that's offered at Duke. But I do want to emphasize you can really major in anything and go into UX. Obviously, it's pretty helpful to have some background in like graphic design or computer science, but one of the greatest things about UX is having that more diverse background because it really helps you empathize with a greater user base. That's one of the greatest strengths I think that you can bring to a UX team. One of my favorite things to talk to other UX people about is their background and how they got into UX and what they can bring, because all the stories are really unique and interesting and varied compared to like all the other fields. And then after graduation, I was recruited into Allstate's leadership development program, which it's a 3-year rotational program where you rotate through 3 different business segments for 1 year each. Again, when I graduated, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, except maybe something kind of creative or business related. So I thought maybe marketing, and I thought joining that rotational program would be kind of a good way to figure it out. My first rotation was in social media marketing, and my manager was really great. And so she encouraged me to network with as many people as possible. And one of the first people that I got to network with was the head of UX. So after talking to him, I knew immediately like that's the field that I want to go into. It's kind of that perfect intersection of creativity, technology, and like that human-centered psychological piece that I was looking for. So I decided to stay in the rotational program to see if I could maybe get lucky and get a UX role. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but I ended up rotating through data analysis and project management. And I really tried to build those skills up in those roles that would be transferable to UX. So for example, being able to handle large volumes of data can really help with synthesizing UX research, and learning how to manage projects is also really helpful when you're working on a product team, of being able to kind of have that PM perspective. And then at the same time, outside of work, I continue teaching myself about UX, networking, and slowly kind of doing freelance and contract UX work to build up my portfolio, which we're going to kind of walk through. So obviously the first step of transitioning into UX is going to be like that education piece, really learning about the design process and the different phases. So here I'm showing the double diamond design process, which I'm not going to get super into details about because, there are a lot of other resources online that can do that. And maybe some of the Hack Duke talks today will be going into that, and they can probably do a better job than I can. But you just need to know, you need to be really familiar with this process and all the different phases and like what deliverables are generally associated with each one. So if somebody says like, oh, we need to do a card sorting exercise or make personas, or I need you to do a hi-fi wireframe or make a rapid prototype, you should be able to kind of be familiar with all of those terms. And then it's also really important to be familiar with this design process when you start applying to jobs, because once you actually start like designing and doing the work, many companies are going to expect you to be what's called a T-shaped designer. So that means you have to have a lot of depth in one area and be able to have breadth across the whole design spectrum as well. But a lot of times the job titles will vary across the industries. So it might look like UX researcher for people who focus on like the front part of this process and the research part. So they do like flow diagrams, or, ethnographic studies. And then the people that focus on the middle, that title might look like an interaction designer or a UX architect. And then jobs focusing kind of on the aesthetic, like end part of it, will be doing like hi-fi wireframes and UI. Those are technically visual designers. And then there are full stack designers out there. Those might be at smaller companies, and those titles will usually be like product designer or UX designer. But you want to be careful just to read the job descriptions to figure out what every company is specifically looking for. A good kind of real life example of that is for Google. They typically have 3 big like UX roles. So they have UX researcher, interaction designer, and visual designer. When I was first kind of learning about UX and like the whole process, I used Pluralsight, the website, just because Allstate had given it to us for free. And right now, Pluralsight is actually offering free courses for the whole month of April. And then obviously as university students, there are a lot of other online places that you can go, like Coursera or Interaction Design Foundation. And I'll have a list of resources and like books and podcasts at the end of the presentation as well. Okay, so another part of being a designer, of course, is having those like technical skills. So being able to use like design tools to actually create your deliverables, your like wireframes, your prototypes. So for myself, I had a little bit of background in this because in college, I took a graphic design class at Duke with Michael Faber. That was probably one of my favorite classes I took at Duke. If you haven't taken it and you can, I would highly recommend it. It's more focused on Adobe Illustrator, which is a little bit more of a graphic design tool than a UX design tool. But once you know one of them, it's a lot easier to learn the other ones. And that class also really taught me like how to take feedback and use it in an iterative design process. Obviously, there are going to be YouTube tutorials for all of these different tools. When I first started, I used Figma, and it is still my personal favorite because it is free, it is super user-friendly, and it's also collaborative, so you can like work with a team remotely all on one document. When you're hiring, I want to like emphasize most companies are going to value your design thinking skills and how you solve problems a lot more than these technical skills, because like these can be learned, these can be taught, whereas your design thinking is kind of unique to you. And also, like I mentioned, once you know one of them, you can kind of learn the other ones and pick them up really fast. If you're still having trouble deciding which ones you want to focus on, you can go look at like the job postings from specific companies. If you're interested in like this company, go look at on their job listing which ones they want you to know. So for example, like at Allstate, we use Zeppelin, Sketch, and Axure. Okay, so networking is so important. I know you guys have heard this over and over again, but it's probably the most important thing in helping like find a job or pivot into a different industry. Networking, it's really helpful, not only because people are gonna like keep you in mind, help you get a job, but it's also a great way to learn from people when you're trying to get into a new industry and build those relationships. When I was at Duke, networking to me, it was something really different. It kind of meant like show up to a career fair or coffee chat with your resume and then like fight 90 other Duke students to try and talk to the recruiter, make yourself seem like the most likable, the most interesting, like pick me, pick me. I don't think that's going to be very helpful for you like in the real world. When I started getting the most out of networking is when I really just like tried to get to know the other person and really like be interested in their journey into UX. This is also now like one of my favorite things to do because again, like people stumble into the UX industry in so many different ways, and you can always pick up different helpful tips for yourself from their stories. So for like myself, when I was networking with people, if I talked to somebody who like went through a boot camp, they were always really happy to share their bootcamp like learning materials with me, so I was able to like learn from that. And then like when I spoke to people who had gone through the UX industry themselves, I learned about websites like catchafire.com. So that's like a volunteering website where you can do pro bono design work for different nonprofits, and they typically don't look for too much experience when you do a project with them, so it's a really good tool for beginners. And when you genuinely care about, other people's work and their stories, they're going to care about you as well. And people in the UX industry, they know how hard it is to break in. Like everyone I talked to was really, really helpful because they've been in that position before. And in fact, like the job offer that I got at Allstate as a UX architect, it was brought to my attention by someone that I'd networked with during my second rotation a year ago, because she remembered like, oh, hey, I remember we chatted and you wanted a full-time UX job. So she sent me a link to the job posting. And then during my final round interview for that job as well, one of the interviews on the panel had been somebody I networked with during my second year. And he remembered talking to me and being like, oh, it's so cool that you're doing this yourself. Like, I'm really proud of you for making it this far. So that really helped to kind of like demonstrate that I was really passionate about getting into UX. So the biggest thing that you need to really work on is like building up your portfolio. And there are so many different ways that you can do this, but I'm going to go and generally outline the way that I kind of took that path. So one of the first things that I did was sign up for the daily UI challenges, which is like a series of 100 design challenges. You can go Google it, sign up for it, and then they'll email you every day. It's completely free. And they give you prompts every day, like design a music player, design a flash message, design a pop-up overlay. I want to emphasize again that in your portfolio, most companies, the thing that they're going to be looking for is your design thinking and your problem solving, like how you're able to design to solve business goals and user needs. And since these prompts are kind of like one-off prompts, you're not going to be able to really show that. They don't really focus on the UX part of things. So maybe they won't be something that you can include in your final portfolio, but I would still definitely recommend it if you're just starting out, because I think it's a great way to start learning kind of like the tools that you're going to be using. So for me, it was a really great way to get more familiar with Figma. And then it was also a really good step for me in getting over my imposter syndrome. So like at this point, I had been kind of like learning and watching online courses of UX and reading books and stuff for about a year. And then every time I tried to start a project, I would get kind of scared and hit a wall. But after doing these UI challenges for a while, I felt a lot more confident and capable in my skills as a designer and my ability to use Figma. So it's also kind of great work to show if you're maybe trying to get like a volunteer or pro bono like project, and they like don't require that much experience, but they still kind of want to see some work that you've worked on in the past. Okay, so when I first started talking to people about like how to build up a portfolio without any experience, the most common suggestion I got was to do individual design exercises. So basically take like an existing app or product that you like and redesign some part of it. I never ended up actually doing one of these myself because I kind of like had trouble thinking like how would I go about doing that. But now that I've kind of like gone a little bit more experience, I want to show you one of the favorite ones that I've seen. It's by an interaction designer at Google named Tony Jin. And I think it's a great example of how you can maybe like do one of these yourself. So he redesigned the Google Photos app, and he targeted the problem that sometimes like photographers will take lots of similar photos at the same time of the same thing or person, and it can get really hard to compare them afterwards to pick the best one. Those highly similar photos also will like clutter the photo libraries and make it hard for them to find what they want later. So he designed a feature that he calls photo groups. It leverages Google's machine learning capabilities to identify similar photos, group them together, suggest the best ones, and facilitate photo comparison. So for research, he did domain research looking at other photo apps like Gemini and Apple Photos, and found that none of the existing products facilitate comparison between photos. And then he also took time to define user needs, which I think is really, really important. And one of the big things that beginner designers will tend to overlook, especially when you're doing an individual design exercise like this, because you are basically kind of making it up, giving yourself the prompt. And you need to remember that as a designer, you're not designing for yourself, you are designing for your user. So you can't just assume that problem is widespread enough that it's worth the effort to design something to solve it. So in order to understand whether the problem is worth solving, he decided to look into photography forums on Reddit and do like a quick semi-structured interview with just like the people around him. I think that's also a really great takeaway from this like design exercise, is that you can still synthesize research even if it's like quick and dirty, kind of just only asking the people around you, only just like looking on the internet. Like you don't have to have a huge budget or a ton of users the way like a corporation might in order to get good user research to use. That's one of the things I wish I knew when I was like at this point earlier on. I always thought like, oh, like I can't really do any user research, like I don't have the resources for it. But really, like in your portfolio, companies just want to see that like you're able to synthesize any kind of information and how you're going to create like a design out of that. So he was able to synthesize his research and create these personas. He knew he was going to be designing for casual photographers or semi-casual photographers, but not for professional photographers. Creating personas like this is a great way to keep in mind your users, and again, tying in those design decisions to your users' needs and goals as you're designing, and make sure you're designing towards your user goals and not like for other people. So final solution that he came up with was similar to, well, the similar photos would be automatically grouped in the camera roll. Users will see all the photos in the group, and when they click on it, they'll be able to navigate around by clicking on the thumbnails and the bottom. The users can also compare photos by tapping on the photo group icon, and for each photo they click, they can hold it and compare it with the photo, which is the recommended one by default. So like he made like a very robust kind of thing with a lot of different features. And so I wanted to share this case study with you because it's one of the best self-directed design exercises that I've seen. And, you know, like as a hobbyist photographer, it's a feature that I would really like to see implemented in real life. And I want to show you that like it is possible to create really great design work just on your own without having to have a client or a stakeholder kind of assign a prompt to you. Okay, but I also know it is not really easy to just come up with like brilliant features for really popular apps that are already, you know, working really well. So if you are a beginner, a great place to start is productdesign.tips /challenge, which it's a website that has a bunch of different design challenges in different kind of overarching categories. And the problems will be like help people to use gasoline cars in cities less often, or help people to reduce food waste. And then they also give you a day-by-day guide to create a case study in a week, which is super helpful if you're just starting out. So day 1 is defining the problem. Day 2 is learning about your users. Day 3 is doing a competitive analysis on existing apps. Day 4 is ideating your solutions. Day 5 is storyboarding the customer's journey and defining tasks. And day 6 is defining success metrics for your testing. So you can even submit your work and win like different prizes on top of getting a really great portfolio piece out of it. So I did this design challenge on reducing food waste as one of my portfolio pieces with one of my friends. And it was really great because it helped me use some tools that I typically won't use in my design process. So for example, we used Miro to map out the customer's journey and get a picture of what interactions our product would need to support. Another really great way to gain experience and get some good portfolio pieces is to join hackathons. So you guys are all kind of ahead of the game already by being here at IDEATE. I've listed a few other good hackathons here, and you can find a lot more at devpost.com. I've personally participated in air rallies twice, and I really liked that because it's an internet accessibility rally. So that means there's a really heavy focus on WCAG or WCAG compliance, that stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So that includes things like making sure that your text has a high enough color contrast from your background to be read by visually impaired people, utilizing different affordances that aren't just color in case your users might be colorblind, adding alt text to images for people who are using screen readers, things like that. So when you join Air Rallies, the hackathon, they make sure you go through a WCAG training so that you have a good understanding on how to be in compliance. And then your website at the end is also judged on how well you follow WCAG. So I really enjoyed it. And then I also really liked it because it's a project that pairs you with a client. So you get to work with a real client, and then you also get to work on a full product team where they give you a PM and you work with some developers as well. So you really get to build those cross-functional collaboration skills that like full-time employers are going to be looking for. And it's also usually a longer timeline. So both the ones I participated in were 2 to 3 months, and that way you get to ship like a cleaner, more fully functional product. And then once you've built up some more like self-directed work, you'll probably have enough to start applying for, you know, the type of volunteer or pro bono projects for nonprofits that maybe will ask you to apply and see some of your previous work. So my two favorite places for doing this are Catchafire and Develop for Good. Catchafire is a skills-based volunteer website where you can sort through different skills. So if you're doing UX design, you'd sort by web design, and you can find a nonprofit that you're interested in. And you do have to apply, and a lot of times they do like a 1-hour phone call with the client, but it's still a lot less competitive than trying to get paid work. And then Develop for Good, I think, will be really, really great for you guys. It's an intercollegiate technology and design organization that pairs engineers and designers to different technical projects at nonprofit organizations. I actually served as a designer and a design lead on a previous project cycle at Develop for Good, and I'm currently on the exec team. We have projects with over 60 plus nonprofit partners, and that includes the WHO, Ronald McDonald House, Save the Children, and a lot more. You do also have to apply for this, and the application can be a little bit competitive. So it is great if you kind of have a portfolio a little bit like built up already. But one of my favorite things about working on the Develop for Good team was that like all of my teammates were a bit more experienced because of the vetting process. So I think that I ended up getting one of my like best, like cleanest portfolio pieces out of it. Another thing that I really like about Develop for Good is that it's really well organized. So there's a project cycle every 10 weeks, every season. And we also provide an industry mentor. So for my project cycle, we had a UX researcher from Google, and that was a great networking opportunity. And through him, I was introduced to a private mentor for myself, who's a designer at Google. And my mentor helped me a lot in my job application journey in terms of like my portfolio review and things like that. And then Develop for Good also provides a lot of different like onboarding, fireside chats, different networking opportunities with the industry mentors and sponsors. And they all work at companies like Netflix, LinkedIn, Amazon, Adobe. So all like the really cool ones. And so if you'd like to get involved with Develop for Good, feel free to like email me after this chat as well. Okay, so once you've built up enough skill and experience through your like volunteer and pro bono work, you should definitely start charging for your work. This is, in my opinion, one of the hardest leaps to make, especially if you kind of have imposter syndrome, which is really prevalent in the design community. But you have to remember to value yourself and all the work that you've done to get to this point. Something that I told myself when I first started was they've seen your work and they decided to hire you as a freelancer or a contractor based on that. If they didn't like your work that you've already done, they wouldn't have hired you. So just keep doing what you've been doing, which is basically a really long-winded way of saying fake it till you make it. Another obstacle that I did have in trying to get like that paid work was obviously finding the gigs. So here are some resources that I've listed out that I used before to try and find work opportunities. That some of them are kind of specific and may not apply to everyone, but Facebook groups, there's Asian Creative Network UX, they have a lot of cool opportunities. Designer Guild, they post like a different monthly like who's looking for jobs, and then HH Design for Slack. Hexagon UX is mostly for women of color, I believe, but they also have like a really great job board. And then they have local channels as well, which is really helpful. And Friends of Figma and Intern.club. And then on LinkedIn, just like make it very clear on your LinkedIn that you do UX work, that you're a designer, that you're looking for UX work. So many of the things that I got were just people messaging me being like, hey, I saw on LinkedIn that you do UX work and I need some UX work done. Are you interested in that? So that has been really helpful as well. And then obviously networking, this is where your networking comes in really handy. So like for me now at this point, after 3 years of constant networking and having built up that network, it's really easy for me to find freelance work because people in the design community, like they will always know someone else who like needs design work done. Okay, so going into your like application process when you start applying for those full-time jobs, you're going to want to narrow down your expertise. Like I mentioned before, you can be a full stack designer, but that does tend to be at maybe like smaller companies or startups. So you just have to level with yourself, like, what do I want? And a lot of the bigger companies like Google, they will want to know your focus. Like, are you a researcher? Are you an interaction designer? Are you a visual designer? And then you need to be able to show your ability to kind of cross collaborate with those other teams, like the PMs and developers and stakeholders. And like, if you're a visual designer, can you take like stuff from the interaction designers? If you're an interaction designer, can you take the stuff from UX researchers and like work with those teams? Okay, and then leveraging your network. Throwing resumes into the void is a much less successful way than like to apply to jobs than having people refer you. In my experience, again, people are all really nice and really helpful. They've been in the same spot you are, so they want to help you out. I have never had anyone say no when I ask them to refer me to their company. So it is always worth asking. And again, if they do, like the worst they can say is no. Okay, and then so for your portfolio review, if you get past that first phone screen and the behavioral interview, you will likely have to do a portfolio review. Companies will typically give you like 45 minutes to an hour to present your portfolio, typically between 1 to 3 case studies. You want to make sure that you create a separate slide deck to present. Don't just kind of walk through your website. By creating a separate slide deck, you will have better control of the narrative and your storytelling. And most important thing in your portfolio review is to focus on telling that story and relating every design decision back to the original problem. They want to see every design decision like relate to the business goal or the user need. It's also a really good opportunity to present assets and design work that show parts of your process that a company might have more emphasis on. So for example, Facebook really likes to see like the final deliverable and how it works. So you would want to make sure to include an interactive prototype in that. Whereas like Google, they really like to see the process as a whole. So don't put too much emphasis on any one part. Make sure instead that you try to show one key deliverable from each step of your process. Okay, and then so sometimes you'll have to do whiteboarding exercises as well, where you're going to be asked to design something, typically an app or a web page, given a time constraint. Sometimes it's on the spot, and it's like 45 minutes to an hour. Sometimes they'll make it take home. You can have a week. So for this, my mentor at Google recommends Solving Product Design Exercises by Artyom Dushinsky. It's what they recommend at most of the big tech companies like Facebook and Google. It's pretty much like the case in point book for consultants. It'll give you that framework for how to solve whiteboard problems, and it'll walk you through some as well as give you some practice challenges to do. The general framework is just, one is why, understanding your goal. Two is who, defining that audience. Three is when and where, understanding the customer's context and needs. And then four is what, when you kind of list out your actual design ideas. So once you kind of learn that framework, you can use it for pretty much all of your whiteboarding exercises. And then, so I know like applying to jobs is really, really hard and there's not a lot of transparency on that. So I wanted to share kind of like the like results that I have had in applying to UX jobs. So overall, I applied to 109 jobs. I got 42 rejections that were just straight up rejections. 60 companies gave me no response whatsoever. And then I ended up getting interviews from 7 different companies. So here's a quick list of kind of resources that I personally really enjoyed when I was going through my journey. Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug. That's one of my favorite UX books because it's like, it kind of really packs a punch. It has all of the important things you need to know about UX, but it's really short. You can sit down and read it in like an hour, which I think is a really good example of UX, like that you can get all that information really quickly. Design of Everyday Things, that's a classic. It's not necessarily just UX design, it's kind of design overall, but it's a great one. Designing Interfaces is really good when you're starting to get more into like the UI of things and actually like designing screens. And then the User Experience Team of One, that one's a really long one, but it is very helpful if you are maybe if you're the only UX designer in like a bigger industry and you're kind of trying to show the importance of UX to the people that you're working with. For podcasts, I really like 99% Invisible. That's not really a UX one. It's also a general design one, but I think it's really good for your like framing your design thinking in general. And then Wireframe, Layout, and UX podcasts are all just kind of general UX podcasts that are good. For courses, again, Pluralsight is what I used, and they're free till the end of the month, so I think that's great. And then Coursera, they recently came out with the Google UX Design Professional Certificate that like I really would have liked to take when I was first starting my UX journey, but it just came out, I think, like a month ago. And then Interaction Design Foundation has a lot of really great resources. And General Assembly, I know, is typically a boot camp, but before COVID, they used to have like free in-person intro courses, which I had taken. And that was also like a really great way to kind of get your feet wet. And then for like inspiration when you're designing, I think Dribbble and Behance are both great. I know Dribbble, like some people talk about the dribblification of UX, which is kind of just focusing on the UI and not solving those design problems. So do be aware of that. But I think both websites are still like really good for kind of getting inspiration if you're stuck on something. So some important takeaways that I want to leave you guys with. Don't be afraid to take risks. You know, the worst case, you fail and it's a learning opportunity. Make sure you value your work in yourself, especially if you're freelancing. When you value yourself more, you're going to get better quality clients. You don't need to spend a lot of money to invest on a degree or a boot camp. Really just seeking to understand and practice the design thinking process is what's going to be the most important here. If you just keep learning through attending events, joining communities, reading, listening to podcasts, and like watching videos, I think that's going to be really helpful for you. In the interviewing process, remember, whether it's during like the behavioral section or the portfolio review or even the whiteboarding exercises, you're always trying to focus on that storytelling aspect, relating your design decisions back to the business goals and the user needs. That's what the company's going to be looking for. And then for networking, focus on getting to know the other person when you're networking. I promise it'll save you like a lot of awkward silences instead of trying to sell yourself. And then be humble and willing to learn. The design community is really great and people are always willing to help you if you let them. So we can take questions now if anybody has any questions.
Thank you so much for this. It was really cool hearing about your story. I was just wondering, out of all the projects you've worked on, if you had a favorite one, that's something that taught you the most and what you got out of that experience.
Yeah, so I would say that I have two projects that I think are the most helpful, or like the best ones that I've done. So one of them is the one that I mentioned that I did with Develop for Good. So I helped redesign a website for Symboli US. I think that one was really good for me because, like I mentioned, one, all of the designers on that were a little bit more experienced, so that gave me like a better portfolio project, but also I was serving as the design lead for that team. So it was me and 6 other designers, and I learned a lot about how to kind of like stand up as a design lead and like do a lot of stakeholder management. So like if the stakeholder maybe like didn't like our design decisions, I was the one that kind of had to be like, here is the UX research we did, here are the decisions we made, and we made it because of like the backing of this UX research. So I was able to kind of like build up those collaborative skills, and those are really helpful to be able to talk about during interviews. And then the other one that I would say, I didn't really mention it because it's an NDA one, but I'm doing an NDA like contracted work right now, helping build a mobile app. So I'm helping build a mobile app from scratch, and that's been really cool because like when you actually build a mobile app from scratch for a company, like you get to do kind of a lot more detail work and different like flows that you might not think of if you're doing like self-design work or like a smaller kind of hackathon thing. You have to kind of think of a lot of different edge cases, and like working with the developer and like your stakeholder is kind of, it gets a lot more complicated, but that like complexity is really helpful as well. And when you're looking for jobs.
I have two questions. So, oh, yeah, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. But I just wanted to ask, like, when the applications open for Design for Good for like this, um, like I think right now is like the spring, but is there like a summer one? And my second question is like, what is like the minimum number of like um projects you should or case studies you should have in your portfolio before you start like applying to things?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the Develop for Good, our spring cycle will be ending, I think, in June. So around then, start looking for like the fall cycle. And then for case studies, most people recommend you have 2 to 3 like good, robust case studies. And that's a really good question because another issue that some people have is like putting too many case studies up there, even though they're not like the strongest ones. And like the recruiters aren't going to look through 6 different case studies. They're going to probably click on the first 2, maybe 3. So like make sure you have 2 to 3 like really good ones that are up there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was just kind of curious because I don't know if you mentioned at the very beginning because I missed some of the very beginning when you were talking,
Mhm.
but I was wondering why you decided to transition into design in the first place.
Yeah. So basically, like I never really knew what I wanted to do. Like even when I was at Duke trying to figure out what I wanted to major in, I didn't know what I wanted to do. Like I made my own major because I was like, I have no idea. And then when I graduated, I got recruited into a rotational program, and you get to kind of like rotate through 3 different business sectors. And I was like, okay, maybe that'll be a good way to figure it out. But then I was networking during my like first rotation with somebody who was in UX, and when they told me about that role, I was like, oh, I didn't know that role existed, but that's kind of exactly what I want to do. Like the creativity, the technology, like the psychological aspect, that was like kind of everything that I wanted to do.
I have a question about what would you say is like one of the biggest mistakes or missteps that you would avoid going into UI UX in this design field?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, let's see. What is the biggest mistakes? I think maybe like taking on design work that like isn't going to be helpful for your portfolio necessarily. Like I did take on some kind of like side projects or freelance projects that I was like, oh, like this will be helpful for my portfolio. Or I was like, any work that comes to me is good work. But I definitely ended up having more work that was maybe kind of like marketing design or like brand design focus, which ended up being work that I couldn't use in my portfolio. So that kind of like wasted a little bit of time. It was like cool to be able to work with those companies, but it wasn't like very helpful for me to try and pivot into UX design.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was curious, so when you're making your portfolio, would you recommend trying to build it from scratch or using a website builder, or if there was any specific difference that you were
That is a really good question. So I built mine from scratch, but I am really bad at coding, so I don't know that that was a good idea. I did it because I was like, I want to prove, like I'm scrappy, I can do it. So if you have like that comp sci background and it's easy for you, like I think that's a good idea. Or like, I don't know if you have something to prove. Most designers definitely just use like a Squarespace, like a website builder, and that's totally, totally fine. That's completely okay. I just like if you want an edge and maybe one of like the bigger, like Google, Facebook companies, I think it helps a little bit to show that you can code. Again, my parents and my friends are all developers, so for me, I was like, okay, if I like run into anything, I can ask them for help. So that's why I decided to code mine from scratch. And then employers, like in interviews, sometimes they're like, oh, you did that from scratch, that's so cool, that's awesome. But I've also had employers who like don't ask about it at all. Like in the interview, they don't mention it. So it is up to you. I think that if you have that skill set and you can, it looks good. It's always a bonus. But if you don't, it's not necessarily like gonna be a detractor.
So piggybacking off of your answer about like including like projects that like design projects that weren't helpful to your portfolio, would you recommend against because like if I'm like coming from like a background in uh like brand design, would you recommend against including those like projects when you only have like two case studies in like UI and UX in your
No, I think
portfolio?
it's totally fine to include them. I would just like again, I would organize it in a way that maybe either differentiate, like you can differentiate it on a different page. It's like, hey, this is like my brand design work if you're like interested in looking at that, or just like make sure it's like at the bottom of the page. So for my website right now, like I have my strongest case studies at the top, and I do still have at the bottom, I have like my like UI design challenge things, or like my photography things, or graphic design things. Those are just at the bottom. So just make sure your stronger cases are at the top, and there's nothing like wrong with including those. Just like try to have them either in a different section or at the bottom. So it's like if the recruiter has time and they want to look at that, they can, but it's not like the most representative of your work. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Hi, I actually have a question. I was wondering, like, when you started freelancing, doing like UX, how were you able to like learn how to price your work, and also develop contracts? I feel like imposter syndrome is like very real for me as well. So I've definitely struggled with that in the past with not necessarily UX design, but just design work in general. So I was wondering if you had any insight.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question as well. So again, there are going to be a lot of like resources in like groups or just online that can probably give you maybe a better breakdown of that. But for me personally, I'll tell you how I did it, which is just like if you think of an entry level like UX designer in the industry, that is typically like 85,000-ish. So like if you break that down into hourly, that's going to be between like $35, $45 an hour. And so think of how much work and experience you have compared to that, say like you need that much experience to be an industry designer. So like when I first started, the very first freelance gig I got, I feel like personally, maybe I was undervaluing myself, but I was like, okay, I don't have nearly that much experience. So I was charging about $15 an hour. But then as I got more experience, I was like, okay, $25 an hour, and just kind of edging towards like, if you were to be a full-time contractor at like United or a company or something, I know that they're charging about $45 an hour for those type of people. And those people usually have about 3 to 5 years of experience. So kind of using that as a gauge to price yourself and how much work you're going to be doing for them is how I did it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
That was really helpful.
Anybody else have questions? Okay, well, if nobody else has questions, I can give you my email, and like you can feel free to email me afterwards if you come up with any questions. I probably should have put it on this slide, but it's my first name, which is Cecilia, CECILIA .XIE17 @gmail.com. So like feel free to reach out at any point in time if you have any questions or if you need any help.